In this video, we're going to look at decision-making traps. Bad decisions can be traced back to the way the decisions were made. The way the human brain works can sabotage our decisions. We use unconscious routines to cope with the complexity inherent in most decisions. What makes all these traps so dangerous is their invisibility. How would you answer these two questions? Is Brazil's population greater than 100 million? What is your best estimate of Brazil's population? Brazil's population is actually in excess of 200 million people. But if you're like most people, the information in the first question anchored you. When considering a decision, the mind gives disproportionate weight to the first information it receives. Initial impressions, estimates, or data anchor subsequent thoughts and judgments. Anchors take many guises. They can be as simple and seemingly innocuous as a comment offered by a colleague or a statistic appearing in a morning newspaper. They can be as insidious as a stereotype about a person's skin color, accent, or dress. In business, one of the most common types of anchor is a past event or trend. A marketer attempting to project the sales of a product for the coming year often begins by looking at the sales volume for past years. The old numbers become anchors. The forecaster then adjusts based on other factors. And this approach, while it may lead to reasonably accurate estimates, tends to give too much weight to past events and not enough weight to other factors. We want to consider what you can do to reduce the anchoring effect. Always view a problem from different perspectives. Try using alternative starting points and approaches rather than sticking with the first line of thought that occurs to you. Think about the problem on your own before consulting others to avoid becoming anchored by their ideas. Be open-minded. Seek information and opinions from a variety of people to widen your frame of reference and to push your mind in fresh directions. Be careful to avoid anchoring your advisors, consultants, and others from whom you solicit information and counsel. Tell them as little as possible about your own ideas, estimates, and decisions. If you reveal too much, your own preconceptions may simply come back to you. Finally, be particularly wary of anchors in negotiations. Think through your position before any negotiation begins in order to avoid being anchored by the other party's initial proposal. We are naturally biased toward alternatives that perpetuate the status quo. We find the status quo comfortable and avoid taking action that would upset it. Breaking from the status quo means taking action. And when we take action, we take responsibility, thus opening ourselves to criticism and to regret. So naturally, we look for reasons to do nothing. Some experiments have shown that the more choices you're given, the more pull the status quo holds. In business, where sins of commission, that is, doing something, tend to be punished much more severely than sins of omission, doing nothing, the status quo holds a particularly strong attraction. Some of the things that you can do to avoid the status quo trap: always remind yourself of your objectives and examine how they would be served by the status quo. Never think of the status quo as your only alternative. Identify other options and use them as counterbalances. Ask yourself whether you would choose the status quo alternative if, in fact, it weren't the status quo. Avoid exaggerating the effort or cost involved in switching from the status quo. Remember that the desirability of the status quo will change over time. When comparing alternatives, always evaluate them in terms of the future as well as the present. And if you have several alternatives, that are superior to the status quo, don't default to the status quo just because you're having a hard time picking the best alternative. Force yourself to choose. Another of our deep-seated biases is to make choices in a way that justifies past choices, even when the past choices no longer seem valid. Our past decisions become what economists term sunk costs. Why can't people free themselves from past decisions? Frequently, it's because they are unwilling, consciously or not, to admit to a mistake. Sometimes a corporate culture reinforces the sunk cost trap. Here are some things that you can do to avoid it. Seek out and listen carefully to the views of people who were uninvolved with the earlier decisions and who are therefore unlikely to be committed to them. Examine why admitting to an earlier mistake distresses you. If the problem lies in your own wounded self-esteem, deal with it head on. Remind yourself that even smart choices can have bad consequences through no fault of the original decision maker, and that even the best and most experienced managers are not immune to errors in judgment. Be on the lookout for the influence of sunk cost biases in the decisions and recommendations made by your subordinates. And don't cultivate a failure-fearing culture that leads employees to perpetuate their mistakes. In rewarding people, look at the quality of their decision-making, taking into account what was known at the time their decisions were made, and not just the quality of the outcomes. Then there is the confirmation trap. This bias leads us to seek out information that supports our existing instinct or point of view, while avoiding information that contradicts it. The confirming evidence bias not only affects where we go to collect evidence, but also how we interpret the evidence we do receive, leading us to give too much weight to supporting information and too little to conflicting information. There are two fundamental psychological forces at work here. The first is our tendency to subconsciously decide what we want to do before we figure out why we want to do it. The second is our inclination to be more engaged by things we like than by things we dislike. Here are some things you can do to avoid the confirmation trap. Always check to see whether you are examining all the evidence with equal rigor. Avoid the tendency to accept confirming evidence without question. Get someone you respect to play devil's advocate, to argue against the decision you're contemplating. Better yet, build the counter-arguments yourself. What's the strongest reason to do something else? Be honest with yourself about your motives. Are you really gathering information to help you make a smart choice, or are you just looking for evidence confirming what you think you'd like to do? In seeking the advice of others, don't ask leading questions that invite confirming evidence. And if you find that an advisor always seems to support your point of view, find a new advisor. Don't surround yourself with yes men. The first step in making a decision is to frame the question. The way a problem is framed can profoundly influence the choices you make. A frame can establish the status quo or introduce an anchor. Let's consider frames as gains versus losses. Imagine you're a marine property adjuster, and your charge is to minimize the loss of cargo on 3 insured barges that sank yesterday. Each barge holds $200,000 worth of cargo, which will be lost if it's not salvaged within 72 hours. The owner of a local marine salvage company gives you two options, both of which will cost the same. Plan A will save cargo of one barge worth $200,000. Plan B has a 1/3 probability of saving all 3 barges worth $600,000 and a 2/3 probability of saving nothing. If you're like most people, Plan A appeals to you more. But suppose the choice had been framed differently. Plan C will lose 2 or 3 cargoes worth $400,000. In Plan D, there's a 2/3 probability of losing all 3 cargoes worth $600,000 and a 1/3 probability of losing no cargo. Plan A is exactly the same as Plan C, and Plan B is exactly the same as Plan D. But when posed this way, most people will choose Plan D. People are risk-averse when a problem is posed in terms of gains. That would be barges saved. But they're risk-seeking when a problem is posed in terms of avoiding losses. In this case, barges lost. They tend to adopt the frame as it is presented to them, rather than restating the problem in their own way. So what can we do to avoid the framing bias? Don't automatically accept the initial frame, whether it was formulated by you or by someone else. Always try to reframe the problem in various ways. Look for distortions caused by the frames. Try posing problems in a neutral, redundant way that combines gains and losses, or embraces different reference points. Think hard throughout your decision-making process about the framing of the problem. At points throughout the process, particularly near the end, ask yourself how your thinking might change if the framing changed. When others recommend decisions, examine the way they frame the problem. Challenge them with different frames. While managers continually make estimates or forecasts about uncertain events, they rarely get clear feedback about their accuracy. The only way to gauge your accuracy would be to keep track of many similar judgments to see if, after the fact, the events you thought had a 40% chance of occurring actually did occur 40% of the time, and that would require a great deal of data. Instead, we often fall into traps of overconfidence, prudence, and recallability. Consider the overconfidence trap. Even though most of us are not very good at making estimates or forecasts, we actually tend to be overconfident about our accuracy. That can lead to errors in judgment and, in turn, bad decisions. Overly confident about the accuracy of their predictions, most people set too narrow a range of possibilities. If managers underestimate the high end or overestimate the low end of a crucial variable, they may miss attractive opportunities or expose themselves to far greater risk than they realize. The prudence trap means when faced with high-stakes decisions, we tend to adjust our estimates or forecasts just to be on the safe side. Worst-case analysis can add enormous costs with no practical benefits, proving that too much prudence can sometimes be as dangerous as too little. With the recallability trap, we can be overly influenced by dramatic events, those that leave a strong impression on our memory. A dramatic or traumatic event in your own life can also distort your thinking. Anything that distorts your ability to recall events in a balanced way will distort your probability assessments. So what can be done about estimating and forecasting traps? To reduce the effects of overconfidence in making estimates, always start by considering the extremes, the low and high ends of the possible range of values. This will help you avoid being anchored by an initial estimate. Then challenge your estimates of the extremes. Try to imagine circumstances where the actual figure would fall below your low or above your high, and adjust your range accordingly. To avoid the prudence trap, always state your estimates honestly and explain to anyone who will be using them that they have not been adjusted. Emphasize the need for honest input to anyone who will be supplying you with estimates. Test estimates over a reasonable range to assess their impact, and then take a second look at the more sensitive estimates. To minimize the distortion caused by variations in recallability, carefully examine all your assumptions to ensure they're not unduly influenced by your memory. Get actual statistics whenever possible. Try not to be guided by impressions. Highly complex and important decisions are the most prone to distortion because they tend to involve the most assumptions, the most estimates, and the most inputs from the most people. The traps we've reviewed can all work in isolation, but even more dangerously, they can work in concert, amplifying one another. So remember, risk management focuses on outcomes, and good outcomes are more likely with a good decision process. Risk management is evidence-based decision-making. Always make sure to examine the evidence that you're using for decisions. Risk management also pays attention to uncertainty. It identifies the most significant uncertainties and examines the effect of variations in the outcomes of those uncertain variables on the decision outcomes of interest.